So, thank you very much for coming back from lunch to listen to me, and thank you to the organisers for extending the invitation to me to talk to you about some Irish Sea Vikings today. My name is Allison and I work for the National Heritage Agency on the Isle of Man. And please excuse me reading from my script, it's just really to maintain my focus so I don't try to talk to you for the rest of the afternoon rather than just 20 minutes. For those of you who don't know, the Isle of Man is here. We are a self-governing British Crown dependency, not part of the UK, and even before Brexit we weren't part of the EU. We're a bit like cooler Channel Islands. Cooler as in weather. But we have one big difference. The Isle of Man, or Manx government today, has its roots in the Viking Age. I'd like to tell you a little bit about this part of our history, specifically about some of the burial evidence and what this might tell us about the relationship between the incoming Vikings and the people who are already living on the island. It's all about geography with us. Looking at the map, you can see how conveniently we are placed for groups of seafaring people from the north wanting to explore, raid, trade, settle and expand their kingdom. From Norway, and we do think the Vikings that came to the Isle of Man are from Norway rather than Sweden or Denmark, it's a natural seaway across to Shetland, over to Orkney, northwest coast of Scotland, and then a stepping stone route of islands, outer and inner Hebrides, down to the Isle of Man. From here, the Vikings could nip over to Dublin, to Merseyside, onto York, to Wales, but also south to Waterford and Ireland, and then on out into the wide world. But I'm going to bring the focus back in and talk about a small island in the middle of the British Isles. We are looking at first contact with the Isle of Man with the Vikings sometime in the late 700s, early 800s. We have evidence of potential beach market sites on the southeast coast, with cut coin fragments, lead weights, pins, all the usual kind of stuff that gets lost and eventually sinks into the soil. At this stage, the Isle of Man probably was a sort of service station on the sea highway, but after time, it became more than a pit stop and the Vikings began to settle. In addition to the island being a handy staging post for travel, it also offered good harbours and fertile land to farm and to feed everyone from. We know the Vikings settled because we have a lot of evidence still visible and still relevant today on the island. Firstly, we have evidence from place names and personal names. Laxey, Snaefell, Sulby, Derby, Fleshick, Sandwick, Foxdale, these are all of Scandinavian origin, but they survive and sit on the signposts alongside the Manx Gaelic place names such as Niarble, Curragh, Douglas, Linyig, Glenmay, Balaf and Ballasalla. Then we have the names of the people. Open a Manx phone book and you'll be confronted with a list that shows all of the influence that the Isle of Man has, including Scandinavian-derived names such as Corkhill, Corlett and Cottier. It's unlikely that such permanent and personal evidence would survive into use today if the Vikings just used the Isle of Man as a trading post. Then we have the archaeological sites and material culture. We have two phases of Viking Age material really. The later stage dates from after AD 1050, it would take a decade or two, pretty much after the Viking Age has finished in most, but not all British places. I'm not really going to go into that period, but it does give definite evidence of settlement on the island. Finds from the earlier stage, from the 800s, include the beach market sites that I mentioned, broken brooches, strap ends, gaming pieces and other lead work. We also have stray finds such as silver ingots and weaponry. But we also have another important set of evidence for this early Viking period. Indeed, most of the archaeological site and artefact evidence from the Viking Age burials so far discovered on the Isle of Man come from this archaeological evidence. So we're going to meet three of the Vikings that the Manx people would have been mingling with in the century between AD 900 and 1000. There are two known Viking boat burials on the Isle of Man. One on the northwest coast at a place called Knockadoonia, which means hill of the church in Manx language, and the one that I'm going to talk to you about on the southeast coast of Balladool, which means O'Doul's farm. Balladool is an amazing site, though visually it's quite unassuming. It sits on a low hill but has great views of the surrounding landscape and seascape. The hilltop actually has evidence of all of the main periods of human activity on the island, from Mesolithic right through to the Viking. And it was in the 1940s, during excavations of the ramparts of an Iron Age hill fort, that you can see in the photo running around the top of the hilltop, that our Viking was discovered. The boat-shaped stone setting that you can see at the bottom of the photo wasn't visible on the surface when Gerhard Bersu, an archaeologist and wartime internee, started his digging. Once found, though, the burial became the focus of the project. Large stone blocks marked the boundary of the cairn. Inside lay over 300 iron nails, the only remains of a wooden boat. It wasn't a Viking longship. At around 10 metres in length, it was more of a coastal trading vessel, ideally sailing around the Irish Sea. At some point, around AD 900 to 930, people had cleared some ground, hauled the boat to the hilltop, and began the laying to rest of an important man. He had been placed in the bottom of the boat, dressed in a fine linen shirt. His possessions indicated a man who had travelled, or at least had links to elsewhere. His high-status grave goods included a fine pin, probably made in the Irish Sea area, along with an intricately carved gilded belt buckle, a whetstone, a flint to strike a light, and silver arm rings. He was a horseman. Ornate spur buckles and straps may have been made in France, and his iron spurs and stirrups perhaps in southern Europe. Buried behind his head, there was a horse bridle with decorated and enamelled mounts. He had been covered by a shield, and he had at least one iron cauldron and knives and a spear by his side. He did not have a sword. There's no evidence of grave robbing, so perhaps the absence of this indicates he was regarded as a trader rather than a raider. After he was placed in the boat, a mound was constructed over it, sealing the Viking and his worldly goods. Over the soil was added a layer of cremated animal remains, livestock for the next world, his horse, as well as ox, pig, sheep or goat, dog, and even a cat got in there. That's always the big start. There was no evidence of a pyre nearby, so it's possible that the animals were cremated on top of the mound and the ashes spread. Can you imagine the sight, sound and smell of the ritual? It must have been quite something in the Manx landscape. Next, once the ashes had cooled, a layer of turf was added to cover the whole mound. The final funerary act was to add a wooden mast to the centre of the mound so that everyone approaching could see that someone important lay there. Now, with apologies for stating the obvious, no one buries themselves. So this ritual tells us that there were at least some members of the society on, or at least visiting the Isle of Man, who regarded our Balladul Viking as being worthy of such a burial. They must also have thought it unlikely that the burial would be disturbed. Over a millennium on, we can find out a bit more about the Viking himself. From the remains of his skeleton, we know that he was around 45 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, strong and muscular, although his teeth had been worn down by the diet of coarse food. Isotope analysis carried out by Dr. Lee Simmons suggests that he spent his early years in northwest Scotland, the Northern Isles of Shetland or Orkney, or Norway itself. Facial approximation by Drs. Caroline Wilkinson and Caroline Needham suggests that he may have looked like this. A little bit Wayne Rooney. But there is still one big question about this burial. As well as the hill fort, the Viking burial, Balladul Hilltop is also the site of an early Christian cemetery which dates to around AD 600 onwards. It also has a keel at the top of the photo, a small rectangular non-congregational stone chapel that was probably still in use, certainly in AD 1000. So whoever buried the Viking in around AD 900 would have been well aware that the site was special to the local Christian community. As they dug the trench to place the boat into, they would also have disturbed the graves of some of that community, some of which contained individuals whose bodies had yet to fully decay. Over 30 stone Christian graves were discovered on the hilltop. You can see the style of them here, stone boxes with the deceased laid out inside, with the large cairn stones on top. There's no mistaking them for anything else, so we can't suggest that the people burying the Viking didn't know they were there. 3 skulls were found in or around the boat burial. One belonged to the Viking, another was too decayed to be assigned as either male or female, and the third one, found near the feet of the Viking, was believed to belong to a woman. The suggestion was that this skull may be from a female buried with the Viking, a slave or a wife sacrificed on his death to accompany him in the afterlife. However, with re-examination, it is now interpreted as being disturbed from the Christian cemetery below the boat. The big question is, though, by disturbing the burials, was the boat burial a deliberate slight on the Christian community that lived on the island and buried their dead at Balladul, or was it a clumsy attempt by the Vikings' buriers to make him part of that community, or at least integrate him into that special place, safe in the knowledge that his grave wouldn't be disturbed? An example of a Manx Viking Age burial that clearly is part of the local community was found during excavations in the 1980s at a site on the west coast, St Patrick's Isle. St Patrick's Isle was also the site of a Christian burial ground. But during excavation, the remains of over 100 individuals, male and female, dating to the Viking Age were uncovered. They were a mix of Christian and Viking burials, some in the stone coffins that we saw from Balladul with no grave goods, others with grave goods. This gives us an interesting picture of a mixed cemetery where pagans and Christians were laid to rest side by side. One of these people is particularly significant with a fascinating story, and I'd like to talk to you about our Viking matriarch, commonly known as the Pagan Lady, due to the amazing grave goods buried with her. She was about 5 foot 5 inches tall and in her middle ages when she died, around AD 950, with no obvious signs of cause of death. She was wearing a woolen dress and possibly a veil or shroud when she was put into her grave, lying on her back with her arms at her side and a pillow filled with down under her head. Her bones were very fragile, but we do know that she suffered from a condition called osteomalacia during life, which had led to her legs becoming bowed. Her grave, shown in the plan here, was of a higher quality than those around her. It was lined along the sides with slate and sandstone slabs, with a double layer of similar stones used as a cover after she'd been laid inside. Below her waist were 2 knives. The handle of one was decorated with silver inlaid wire. By her left knee were 2 small stones, similar to a miniature pestle and mortar. In the middle of the grave were a bone comb, a pair of iron shears, and a pouch containing 2 needles. Near her waist were 2 amber beads and fossil ammonites that had been pierced. To her right side lay an iron rod that had been wrapped in fabric, had a plant placed on top, and still had the impression of fabric and the wing feather of a bird in its rust. And around her neck were lots of beads, along with a bronze rod and some bronze fragments. It is impossible to reconstruct the necklace with accuracy. The beads could have been on a single string as we usually display them, with the bronze objects forming another pendant, or they could have been strung in 2 or 3 separate necklaces. However the beads were worn, they show remarkable variety. There are glass millefiori beads made in the Mediterranean and the Middle East between AD 875 and 950. There are jet beads, probably from Whitby in North East England, and amber beads, probably from the Baltic Sea area. Some of the very small plain glass beads may have been made in England 400 years before the pagan lady wore them. There are other bead necklaces from female graves of this period from Scandinavia and elsewhere, but I would say that there are only a few that match the pagan lady for variety, status, and just plain glamour. There is 1 or 2 things that seem to be absent from the grave, though. One of the most typical components of women's costume in the Viking Age are the oval brooches, worn in pairs, often with beads in between, and found in women's graves. The fact that this kind of brooch wasn't present in the grave of the pagan lady has led to the theory that she wasn't from Scandinavia and that she may have been from the Isle of Man. But as for the Balladul Viking, Lee Simmons has carried out isotope analysis of the teeth, and the results indicate that she was not local, but from elsewhere in northwestern Europe. Also, the brooches had started going out of fashion by the time the pagan lady was buried, so perhaps she was just particularly on trend. So who was our pagan lady? What can we say about her life? There have been 2 theories offered. The first sees her as a valued head of the family and household, buried with the tools of her trade. Her bowed legs were a result of vitamin D deficiency, perhaps from having many children in quick succession. The decorated knife was of a type found in Scandinavia and England, so could have been a keepsake from her homeland. The plain knife probably being used every day in the preparation of food. The comb, shears and needles similarly would have been used frequently, along with the wing of a bird, perhaps to dust house surfaces or to baste with fat and herbs joints of meat cooked on the iron rod used as a cooking spit. The wonderfully coloured beads around her neck and the fossil pendant could have been gifts from her Viking husband, souvenirs from his travels. The second theory was put forward by Neil Price. He suggests that the pagan lady was a wise woman and a seer. Drawing on descriptions from the sagas, he sees the pagan lady as being one of a number of female burials, the rest in Scandinavia, that display the traits of belonging to sorceresses. An extract from Eric's saga describes the visit of one such woman. A high seat was prepared for her and a cushion laid upon it. When she arrived in the evening, she was wearing a blue cloak fitted with straps decorated with stones right down to the hem. She wore a string of glass beads around her neck. On her head, she wore a black lambskin hood lined with white catskin. She had a staff in her hand with a handle on it. It was fitted with brass and set with stones up around the handle. Around her waist, she had a belt of tinder wood on which was a leather pouch. In it, she kept the charms that she used for her sorcery. Similar sources also suggest that payment for advice or services of a wise woman could be made in beads, and magical qualities could have been assigned to some of the belongings buried with the pagan lady. For example, amber was believed by some to be a cure for a swelling of the neck and to ease birth pains. Jet was used to keep away venomous beasts, and also was believed to have some anaesthetic qualities, and the motif of one of the cylindrical beads was thought to ward off the evil eye. And of course, the staff of office was the iron rod, though not as elaborate as that described in the saga. Our pagan lady then perhaps offered small-scale magical, medicinal and advisory assistance to the community. The second theory is far from being accepted by many scholars of the period who prefer the first theory. But I would ask whether we have to choose one theory over another. It is entirely possible that the pagan lady held both roles during her life, one being as important as the other. What we do know is that she was buried with belongings that signified what she did in this life and what she would need in the next, just like the male Vikings that went before her. She was important to her community in whatever roles she held, demonstrated by the fact that they gave her such a fine burial. Going back to the not burying yourself theme, our pagan lady had influenced others and they ensured that she would be equipped to continue her important role or roles after death. Unlike the Balladil Viking, there is no doubt that the pagan lady was integrated into the local community in death. So presumably she was in life too. But before I get too carried away and give you an impression of a feminist idyll on the Isle of Man 1,000 years ago, there is one more burial that I want to tell you about. I mentioned earlier about one of the skulls in the boat burial at Balladil, now usually interpreted as coming from a disturbed Christian burial, rather than being the result of a human sacrifice in the Viking Age. However, there is evidence from a site on the northwest coast of the island that is hard to argue with and which challenges our ability to interpret the past without judgment. Sometime around AD 900, a man dressed in a woolen cloak fastened by a pin was placed in a wooden coffin. In the coffin with him were placed spears, a knife, a shield and a finely crafted sword broken into 3 pieces. The coffin was placed into a grave and covered with white sand, then turf, up to a height of about 1.2 metres. On this mound was then placed the body of a woman in her 20s, which in turn was covered by a layer about 8 centimetres thick of a mixture of cremated animal bones, earth and charcoal. A final layer of earth and possibly turf was added to complete the mound. The woman's skull had been slashed by a heavy, sharp implement, leaving a large hole on the top. We know a little bit about practice of sacrifice from the writings of Ibn Fadlan, an Arabian trader who, in the 920s, came into contact with a group of Vikings. He described one of the funerals in great detail, including how a slave girl was sacrificed. Just read you a short extract. The old woman seized her head and made her enter the dome and entered with her. Thereupon the men began to strike with the sticks on the shields so that her cries could not be heard and the other slave girls would not seek to escape death with their masters. As with most documentary sources, of course, we can't take things only at face value. We have to allow for motive and bias. But we are confronted with the real possibility that just over 1,000 years ago, there was at least part of a community that condoned and practiced such rituals. So what picture of the Isle of Man in the Viking Age do these burials leave us with? a local community horrified at the desecration of their graves and at human sacrifice or mutilation by an incoming people, yet appreciative of the counsel of a pagan lady? Or did the native community embrace the beliefs of the newcomers, exercise religious tolerance and encourage shared special places, whilst helping to ensure the burial practice of the deceased's heritage were respected? Or was the community on the Isle of Man divided between those who supported and or profited from the presence of Vikings and those opposed to their pagan beliefs? Most likely, perhaps, there were not clear and neat divisions. But it is possible to argue that as there is a mix of pre-Viking and Viking names surviving, the incoming community became integrated into the existing Christian community. The manifestations of the pagan beliefs were relatively few and occurred over a short space of time, and Christianity won the battle for spiritual prominence and hearts and minds. But perhaps the incoming Vikings won an equally important battle. The most tangible legacy of the Viking Age on the Isle of Man is our parliament, called Tingwald from the Old Norse Thingvellir, gathering or meeting place. Its origins may be traced back 1,000 years to the Vikings. In addition to ordinary sittings throughout the year, the Parliament also still meets in the open air every midsummer. Tingwald today enables the island to function almost independently. This entity that started off as a law-giving and justice-serving gathering of free men survives, and now includes the full functions of any government: education, social care, trade and enterprise, all things that a good Viking could be very proud of. After the Viking Age had ended in most other places, it continued on the Isle of Man. The medieval manuscript of Chronicles of the Kings of Man in the Isles say that once William the Conqueror, when at Hastings, he subjected the English to perpetual slavery. By contrast, the Isle of Man flourished. Over the following 200 years of Norse rule, it saw the building of great religious structures and castles, production of carved works of art, and trade in all kinds of goods. Wealth was amassed on the Isle of Man and, more commonly than you may imagine, hidden there for safekeeping. A veritable medieval offshore financial centre. But that's a whole other story.
If you do have any questions at all for Alison, I would ask you to just hold on for the time being. I'm going to ask our next speaker, Amanda, to take the floor.